Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video.
Thanks for watching. Follow a brighter destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
The conference room on the 31st floor of the Ashcombe Grand Hotel smelled like fresh coffee and old money. Rain streaked the windows overlooking Wacker Drive, blurring the Chicago skyline into gray watercolor smears. Contracts had been signed in that room before, contracts that built bridges and turbines and entire neighborhoods of jobs. None of them mattered as much as the one sitting on the table at 2:14 in the afternoon. Nathaniel Hale sat at the head of that table in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been poured onto him. His face was calm, clean-shaven, the kind of face that made people trust him before he said a word. 26 years he had spent building Hale Industrial Group, from a single machine shop in Cicero into one of the largest heavy engineering firms in the Midwest. He believed, the way some men believe in gravity, that a handshake meant something. Across from him sat 4 executives from Vosbruck Manufacturing, flown in from Stuttgart the night before, still faintly jet-lagged, drinking hotel coffee out of white cups with the Ashcombe Grand's crest stamped in gold along the rim. Their lead negotiator, Klaus Bruck, kept glancing at his watch. He had a flight back to Germany at 9:40 that evening, and he wanted the deal finished with time to spare, so that he could call his wife from the airport lounge and tell her, honestly, that the trip had been worth the 10 days away from home. Nathaniel's faux phone sat face down on the table beside a legal pad covered in his own small, careful handwriting. He had read through the final draft of the agreement 14 times over the past 2 weeks, checking every number against the projections his own finance team had built, satisfied that the numbers were fair to both sides. What he had not checked, because it had never once occurred to him that he needed to, was whether the words being spoken across that table were the same words being repeated back to him in English a half-second later. Between the two sides sat the man everyone in that room was quietly depending on. Preston Dale, 53 years old, a certified interpreter with 18 years of experience and a reputation as clean as his pressed white shirt. He smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows how a story ends. Nobody in that room knew he had decided the ending 3 weeks earlier. This was not the first meeting between the two companies. It was the 4th, spread across 4 months, and the earlier 3 had already left small cracks in a partnership that should have been simple. In March, a shipping timeline that Nathaniel's team had proposed came back from Stuttgart rewritten into something unrecognizable, harsher and more rigid than anything either side had discussed out loud. In April, a routine safety clause turned into a 2-week standoff over wording nobody remembered agreeing to in the first place. In May, an entire Friday afternoon collapsed into silence after Klaus Bruck reportedly demanded a clause that, in the room, he never actually said. Each time, Preston Dale had been the only bridge between the two languages, and each time both sides quietly blamed the other for the friction, never once suspecting the bridge itself. Nathaniel's general counsel, a sharp-eyed woman named Iris Delacroix, had raised a small flag after the May meeting. She told Nathaniel, over coffee in his office on the 44th floor of the Hale Tower on LaSalle Street, that something about the pattern felt engineered rather than accidental. That 4 months of negotiations should have produced more trust and less friction, not the other way around. Nathaniel had listened, nodded, and done nothing, because the man delivering every translated sentence in that room came recommended by 2 other firms and 18 years of clean paperwork. Trust, once it is built, does not ask to be questioned. It simply waits to be broken. By the time the 4th meeting arrived on that rainy Tuesday in early June, both sides walked in tired in ways neither could quite explain, the particular exhaustion of 2 honest parties who had spent 4 months arguing about things neither of them had actually said. 2 floors below, in the hotel's restaurant, 27-year-old Emma Hollis was refilling a sugar dispenser at table 9. She wore the plain black and white uniform every server at the Ashcombe wore, her hair pulled back, an apron with a coffee stain shaped like the state of Ohio just above her hip. Nothing about her said she mattered to anyone. That was, in its own way, the whole point of what was about to happen. Emma had once been 3 courses away from a bachelor's degree in linguistics at the University of Illinois. Her father's heart surgery had cost $41,000 that insurance refused to cover, and Emma had walked out of her spring semester to work double shifts instead. Her grandmother, born in Freiburg, Germany and widowed young, had raised Emma for 6 years of her childhood and never once spoke English inside her own kitchen. By the time Emma turned 12, she dreamed in 2 languages without noticing which one. She still read German novels on her lunch break, tucked into a back booth with a paperback held under the table like contraband. She still corrected the subtitles on German films under her breath, out of habit, the way some people hum along to songs they don't remember learning. 3 months earlier, during the March meeting, Emma had noticed something small and strange while clearing plates. A German phrase about extending a delivery deadline had come back through Preston Dale's mouth as a flat refusal. She had mentioned it, quietly and carefully, to her floor manager, a tired man named Roland Pace who ran the banquet staff like a ship taking on water 1 leak at a time. "You sure about that?" Roland had asked, not looking up from the schedule board he was marking with a chewed pencil. "I think so," Emma had. It sounded different than what he said out loud. Roland had laughed, not unkindly, the laugh of a man who had heard 100 small complaints that week and filed all of them under things he did not have time for. "Emma, that man's got a law degree and a translator's license and a client list longer than my arm. You've got a coffee pot, worry about the coffee, let the professionals worry about the contracts." She had let it go. She told herself she had misheard. She had told herself, walking home along Michigan Avenue in the rain that night, that it was not her place, and for 3 months she had almost believed it, right up until the afternoon she no longer could. At 2:31 that afternoon, Emma was asked to bring a fresh coffee service up to the 31st floor. She had done it 11 times that year for smaller meetings. This one was different only because the tray was heavier, and the room was quieter than usual when she pushed the door open with her hip. She set the carafe down without a sound. She was 3 steps from the exit when Klaus broke something in German, low and careful, about protecting the jobs of the 400 workers at his company's Illinois plant. Then Preston Dale opened his mouth and told Nathaniel Hale something else entirely. Emma stopped walking. She did not understand every word. She did not need to. She understood enough to know that the sentence coming from Preston Dale's mouth in English had almost nothing to do with the sentence that had just been spoken in German. Where Klaus Brook had offered reassurance, Preston Dale delivered a threat. Where the German executive had promised flexibility, the interpreter announced new, sweeping demands that had never been discussed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He had trusted this partnership for 4 months of negotiations. He looked at Klaus Brook's face and saw confusion there, the confusion of a man who had just watched his own words get twisted into something unrecognizable, though he had no way of knowing it yet. Emma set her tray down on the sideboard near the door. Every instinct told her to walk out and forget what she had heard. Waitresses did not correct interpreters. Waitresses did not interrupt billion-dollar negotiations. She had rent due on the 4th of the month, a car payment 3 days late, and a manager 3 floors down who had fired a server the year before for far less than what she was considering. She stayed by the door anyway. 10 minutes later it happened again. Another German sentence, careful and specific, about a shared safety inspection timeline. Another English sentence from Preston Dale that bore no resemblance to it, an accusation instead of a proposal. Klaus Brook's youngest colleague, a junior engineer named Sophia Lenz who had studied a semester of English in Munich, frowned faintly at the translation, uncertain of her own ear, and said nothing. Emma's hands went cold. This was not a mistake. Mistakes did not happen with this kind of precision, 3 times now across 4 meetings, always bending in the direction of making both sides angrier. Somebody was doing this on purpose, and doing it well enough that not one person at that table had noticed yet. If you were standing in that room right now, would you have the courage to say something, knowing it might end your job before the sentence even finished leaving your mouth? Hold on to that question, because the answer changes everything by the end of this story. A third mistranslation came 4 minutes later, one about liability insurance, and this time Nathaniel actually stood halfway out of his chair, his voice sharpened as he asked Klaus Brook whether Voss Brook was truly prepared to walk away from 400 jobs over a clause nobody had raised before that afternoon. Klaus Brook's face went pale with a confusion of his own. Neither man understood that they were now arguing about a sentence that had never actually been spoken. There is a particular kind of loneliness in watching two honest people argue over a lie neither of them told. Emma felt it settle over the room like the rain outside the window, steady and cold and impossible to ignore once you noticed it. She thought about her rent. She thought about her car payment. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen in Freiburg, and the sentence her grandmother used to say whenever Emma tried to talk her way out of something, she already knew was true. A lie only needs one person willing to stay quiet. Emma had been staying quiet for 3 months. She realized, standing by that door with a coffee tray in her hands, that she did not want to stay quiet for a fourth. Emma stepped forward. Her voice when it came out was quieter than she wanted it to be. "I'm sorry," she said, "but that isn't what he said." Every head in that room turned toward her at once, the way heads turn toward a car crash. "Excuse me?" Preston Dale said, and there was already an edge under the smoothness of his voice. "I understand German," Emma said. "Mr. Pschruck said something about protecting the workers at the plant." "That's not what came out in English." Preston Dale laughed first, a short, dismissive sound. He told the room, in the gentle, patient tone of a man explaining something to a child, that she had misheard, that she was a server, not a linguist, that these things were complicated and best left to professionals. Said, turning to Nathaniel, "I've done this for 18 years. I don't think we need a second opinion from the coffee cart." "I'm not asking for credit," Emma said, and her voice held steadier than she expected it to. "I'm asking someone to check." He suggested almost kindly that she return to her duties, before this became embarrassing for everyone, herself especially. An assistant manager, watching from the hallway, had already radioed for help, and 2 hotel security guards arrived at the door within 90 seconds. Nathaniel Hale raised one hand, and the guards stopped where they stood. He studied his face for 3 full seconds. She was not angry. She was not looking for attention. She looked like someone standing at the edge of a decision she had already made, and could not take back, and was terrified anyway. Nathaniel turned to Klaus Brook and asked, in plain and careful English, whether he would be willing to repeat his last sentence slowly, one more time, for the record. Klaus Brook agreed. He spoke the sentence again. Emma translated it back into English, her voice steadier now that the worst part was already behind her. On a video call feed still connected from that morning's earlier session, a remote interpreter from an independent firm in Milwaukee confirmed her translation almost word for word, unprompted, simply because she had been listening the whole time and recognized the discrepancy herself both the moment she heard it, repeated. 1 wrong sentence became 3. 3 became 7. Somewhere past the 7th discrepancy, Preston Dale stopped smiling. The room did not explode into shouting the way rooms do in movies. It went silent, instead, the particular silence of people recalculating everything they thought they understood about the last 4 months. A dust mote drifted through a shaft of gray afternoon light near the window, and for a moment nobody in that room moved at all. Sophia Lenz, the junior engineer, quietly exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding since March. Security asked Preston Dale politely to step into the hallway. He refused at first, insisting the accusations were absurd, that he had 18 years of unblemished work behind him, that a hotel employee's opinion carried no professional weight against a certified linguist. He said the word policy twice, as though invoking it might make the last 20 minutes disappear. He said, almost to himself, that he was simply enforcing precision, that language was more complicated than people who did not speak it could understand. It was the hotel's head of security, checking Preston Dale's coat for his hotel key card, who found the second business card tucked inside the interior pocket. It read Corrigan Dynamics Advanced Systems, a competitor headquartered in Milwaukee that had lost the Vosbruck contract to Nathaniel's company 11 months earlier. That should have been the end of it. It was only the beginning of the second half of this story, so stay with me, because what Nathaniel's legal team found over the following 11 days was worse than anyone in that room imagined at 2:31 that afternoon. Nathaniel postponed the signing, not to punish Vosbruck but to protect them. He hired an outside forensic auditing firm, Ferris & Cole Investigations, and asked them to trace every contract Preston Dale had interpreted for Hale Industrial Group over the past 3 years. Iris Delacroix ran the internal side of the review herself, pulling 11 binders of translated correspondence out of storage and laying them across a conference table on the 44th floor. She read each document twice, once for the English, once cross-referenced against a certified retranslation she commissioned from an entirely separate firm in Milwaukee. By the end of the second day, 9 of the 11 documents showed discrepancies. Small ones at first glance, a softened deadline here, a hardened penalty clause there. Nothing that looked like an accident once you lined 9 of them up side by side on the same table, under the same fluorescent light. The second piece of evidence arrived on a Thursday. A records request to Preston-Dale's cell carrier turned up 11 calls, each under 2 minutes, placed to a Milwaukee number over the previous 5 months. The number traced back to a project director at Corrigan Dynamics named Victor Amsel. One voicemail, left by mistake, on a colleague's old work phone that still forwarded to Preston-Dale's line, contained Victor Amsel's own voice discussing a payment of $47,213, wired in 3 installments, in exchange for what he called, on the recording, keeping negotiations difficult. The third piece of evidence came from Corrigan Dynamics itself. Facing a subpoena and the threat of a federal fraud investigation, 3 members of its board confirmed during a deposition call that Victor Amsel had, without their formal authorization, arranged payments to an outside interpreter to disrupt Hale Industrial's biggest deals. It was corporate sabotage, plain and documented, sitting in a folder on a lawyer's desk by the second week of the following month. Then came the part that turned this from one bad interpreter into something far larger. 3 former clients came forward once word of the investigation reached the trade press. The first was a grain storage company out of Dayton, Ohio, called Redfield Agricultural Supply. Its founder, a 58-year-old man named Walter Kess, sat for a recorded statement with investigators and described losing a $9 million equipment partnership with a Japanese supplier 2 years earlier, after their partners suddenly and inexplicably accused Redfield of bad faith mid-negotiation. I went back over every email we sent for 6 months, Walter told the investigator, according to the transcript later filed with the civil complaint. I thought I'd offended them somehow. I apologized twice for something I never did. I never once thought to blame the man translating the words. Preston-Dale had been the interpreter on that deal, and the accusation, it turned out, had never actually come from the Japanese side at all. The second was an oil services firm based in Midland, Texas, called Blanton Field Solutions. Its operations director, a woman named Carol Ibsen, described losing a partnership with a Brazilian supplier after a translated safety report mysteriously reversed its own conclusions somewhere between the Portuguese original and the English summary handed to her board. Her engineering team had spent 5 weeks redesigning a component to correct a flaw that, according to the actual Portuguese report, had never existed in the first place. The correction alone cost an estimated $280,000 before anyone realized the translation itself was the defect, not the equipment. Preston-Dale had certified that summary as accurate, and billed $1,100 for the work. The third was an auto parts supplier out of Flint, Michigan, called Coker Precision Parts. Its owner, David Coker, described spending $406,000 in legal fees settling a contract dispute that, 18 months later, was traced back to a single mistranslated liability clause in a supplier agreement. I almost sold the building my father built this company in, David said in his statement. Over 3 sentences that never meant what he told us they meant. Preston-Dale had certified that document as accurate as well, and had never once been asked to explain the discrepancy until a Chicago waitress noticed this one sentence and didn't sound right. 3 years and 400 miles away from Flint, Michigan. 3 separate companies. 3 separate industries. 3 men who had spent years blaming themselves, their partners, or simple bad luck. 1 interpreter at the center of all of it who had spent nearly a decade quietly deciding which American businesses deserved to succeed and which ones did not. Preston-Dale never once admitted fault, not to the state interpreters licensing board, not to the federal investigators, not even to his own attorney, according to court filings later made public. He maintained, through every hearing, that he had simply been enforcing what he called linguistic precision standards, insisting the discrepancies were matters of professional interpretation, rather than deliberate deception. He said it in his final statement to the licensing board the way a man says a prayer he no longer believes, out of habit rather than conviction. The Illinois Judicial and Court Interpreters Certification Board revoked his license within 31 days. Following a hearing in which Preston Dale represented himself, and read a 7-minute statement insisting that language was too complex a craft to be judged by people who had never studied it professionally. The board voted 6-0 to revoke his certification anyway. Meridian Language Partners, the agency that had staffed him on contracts worth an estimated $14 million over 3 years, terminated his contract within a week and opened its own internal review of every assignment he had completed since 2019, ultimately identifying 19 additionals flagged for examination, 3 of which resulted in separate civil settlements over the following year. Victor Amsel was indicted on charges of corporate espionage and wire fraud the following spring, and resigned from Corrigan Dynamics before the arraignment. Corrigan Dynamics settled a civil suit with Hale Industrial Group for an amount neither company would publicly disclose, though court filings later showed a payment of $2,108,000, along with a public statement acknowledging that Amsel had acted, in the company's words, far outside any sanctioned business practice. Preston Dale had spent 18 years believing his decision made him better than the business people who hired him, that he alone understood how much meaning lived in the smallest turns in a phrase. And that decision, left unchecked for long enough, curdled into something else entirely. By the time Victor Amsel first called him, 2 years earlier, offering money to bend a handful of sentences, Preston Dale had already convinced himself he was not committing fraud at all, only correcting the sloppy, careless way ordinary business people failed to appreciate the language they depended on. It was easier to call it a standard than to call it what it was. Preston Dale to this day has never issued an apology. Some men would rather lose everything than admit they were ever wrong about anything. That is not strength, that is simply the slowest possible way to fall, one refusal at a time, until there is nothing left to refuse with. Roland Pace found Emma in the kitchen 2 days after the hearing results became public inside the hotel, before they ever reached the newspapers. He didn't say much. He told her he was sorry he hadn't listened back in March, that he had spent 3 months assuming a coffee pot mattered more than her ear for language, and that he wouldn't make that mistake again with the next person who tried to tell him something inconvenient. Emma told him it was all right. It was not entirely all right, but she understood, better than most people, how easy it is to dismiss a small warning when believing it would cost you something. Back on the day it all began, once the security guards had escorted Preston Dale out and the room had settled into stunned quiet, Nathaniel Hale did something that surprised even his own legal counsel. He apologized personally to Klaus Bruck and the Vossbruck delegation for the confusion, and asked for 48 hours to bring in certified, independent interpreters before resuming negotiations. Klaus Bruck agreed without hesitation. He later told a trade reporter that Nathaniel's patience in that moment, rather than his money, was the reason Vossbruck chose to trust him at all. Those 48 hours were not quiet ones. Iris Delacroix personally vetted 6 candidates from 2 competing agencies, checking references that went back 15 years, calling former clients at odd hours to ask questions that had never occurred to her to ask before that Tuesday. Klaus Bruck, for his part, insisted on flying in his own company's German-English translator from Stuttgart on a red-eye, a soft-spoken woman named Greta Voss, who had no relation to the Bruck family despite the shared surname, and who reviewed every clause twice before reading it aloud. By Thursday morning both sides sat back down at the same table, though it no longer felt like the same room. 2 interpreters worked in parallel now, one for each company, checking each other's work sentence by sentence, occasionally pausing mid-conversation to compare notes in low voices before continuing. It was slower. Nobody in that room complained about the extra time it took. 2 days later, under new interpreters from 2 unaffiliated firms working in parallel to verify each other, the agreement was signed at 11:52 in the morning. It created 412 new manufacturing jobs across 3 Illinois counties over the following 2 years, jobs that had almost disappeared entirely because of 11 phone calls and $47,000. Nathaniel went looking for Emma afterward. He found her in the restaurant kitchen, clearing plates, already certain in her own mind that she had been fired, and simply hadn't received the phone call yet. Roland Pace stood near the pass-through window, watching, saying nothing. "You're not fired," Nathaniel said before she could ask. "I came to thank you." Emma set down the plate she was holding. "I probably should have kept quiet." "No," Nathaniel said. "You shouldn't have, that's the whole point." He told her that real courage rarely comes from people with titles or security clearances or seats at the table. It comes from ordinary people who notice something is wrong, and refuse to pretend they didn't, even when pretending would have cost them nothing at all, and would have been so much easier. He asked her, almost as an afterthought, what she had studied before she left school. When she told him linguistics, 3 courses short of a degree, he went quiet for a moment, the way a man goes quiet when he is doing math he has already decided the answer to. He didn't offer her a reward. He offered, through the Hale Family Foundation, to cover the remainder of her tuition, calling it an investment rather than a gift, because her honesty, he said, had already proven worth more to his company than the 412 jobs the contract itself would create. "Consider it paid forward," he told her. "Somebody has to keep noticing the sentences the rest of us miss." Emma finished her degree the following spring with distinction, graduating alongside classmates 8 years younger than her. Her father sitting in the second row of the ceremony in a suit he had bought specifically for that afternoon. Stay with me, because the last part of this story is the part most people forget to ask about, the part where an ordinary decision keeps paying interest for years after the moment itself is over. 3 years after graduation, Emma became Director of Certified Interpretation Services at Hale Industrial Group, a position that did not exist before she created it. Every major negotiation the company entered from that point forward used at least 2 independent interpreters working without contact with one another, cross-checking each translation in real time, a policy that industry publications began referring to, only half-jokingly, as the Hollis Standard. 2 other Midwestern manufacturers adopted a version of the same policy within 18 months, after Hale Industrial published its internal findings as a case study for the National Association of Judiciary Interpreters. When students at her old university ask her, during the guest lectures she still gives every autumn, how her career actually began, she never mentions the hotel or the billionaire or the size of the contract. She tells them there is a moment, usually small and usually inconvenient, when staying quiet feels safer than telling the truth. She tells them that whoever you become is decided in that moment and nowhere else. Nathaniel never forgot the lesson either. He kept a photograph on his office wall, not of the signed contract but of the empty conference room, taken the afternoon everything almost went wrong, the coffee carafe still sitting where Emma had left it on the sideboard. He said it reminded him that the cost of a small silence is always larger than the cost of a small uncomfortable truth, and that the most expensive mistakes a company ever makes are rarely the ones written into a contract. They are the ones spoken out loud in a room full of people too polite, or too frightened or too certain of their own place, to ask a second time whether what they just heard was actually true. 3 years later, on another gray Chicago afternoon, Emma stood at the back of a training session for 6 newly certified interpreters, watching them learn a job she once thought she had lost forever the moment she picked up a coffee tray. She still kept the old apron, the one with the coffee stain shaped like Ohio, folded in the bottom drawer of her office desk, not out of sentiment exactly, but as a reminder of the version of herself who had almost decided silence was easier. Nathaniel watched from the doorway, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because nothing needed to be said. Somewhere down the hall, a junior engineer named Sophia Lenz, now on secondment to the Chicago office after Voss Bros at its partnership with Hale Industrial the following year, walked past carrying a folder of her own, and nodded at Emma the way people nod at someone they will never fully be able to thank. Walter Kess, the grain storage founder from Dayton, sent Emma a handwritten letter that same year, thanking her for a courage she had shown a company she had never even heard of, 400 miles away, in a hotel restaurant she had never expected to become the place where any of it started. She kept that letter in the same drawer as the apron. Sometimes the most important voice in the room belongs to the person everyone else has already stopped noticing. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that honesty is worth more than the fear of losing everything, take a moment right now and like this video. Leave a comment telling us about a time you spoke up when it would have been easier to stay silent. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that their voice matters today. And subscribe to this channel, because we tell true-to-life stories like this one every single week, stories about ordinary people who quietly changed everything. Truth spoken with courage will always outlast power built on lies. Disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.